Okay, so we'll get underway with this webinar. So today I'm talking about marine connectivity modelling, just development of that concept and a bit of background in terms of different case studies that we've been involved in here at DHI. So just an overview of the modelling. So just an overview of the webinar. So just some examples of marine connectivity, how we've approached it, and the development of this connectivity approach in terms of how it's evolved over the last few years in terms of applying connectivity models to the marine space. And then finally, I'll just run through a couple of local case studies. One from Porirua Harbour, where we looked at indicator bacteria and sediments, so looking at the linkages between land-based generation and the effects on the marine receiving environment, and then finally just go through the Okura Waiiti study that we did for the Auckland Council, just an overview of that work and the development of a web portal for that particular study. So it's combining all the data from a project into a one sort of web portal in terms of client using that. So just briefly go through some examples of what we mean by marine connectivity. Firstly, just a few international examples. So this is work that DHI has done in various places around the world. So looking at work that's been carried out in Singapore, looking at coral reef connectivity. So this is the area within the Singapore Straits. So looking at the combined effects of larval mortality, settlement processes in terms of coral reef larvae, water temperature effects, suspended sediment concentrations, and then looking at the hydrodynamics, so how the flows transport material in the water column. So the image on the right is just showing a 5-day snapshot of connectivity, so that the red areas are the areas of high connectivity between various coral reef areas within the model domain, and then the downstream connection in terms of the transport that's happened over the 5-day period after spawning. So just an introduction to the process in terms of what's involved. Another study was looking at plastic tracking within Jakarta Bay. So we've got a broad scale hydrodynamic model of Jakarta Bay, and then on top of that we built a particle tracking model which was inputting plastics from the various rivers that feed into Jakarta Bay, and then we can run the model simulation, and it gives us this density map. So it's showing areas where you're getting the highest levels of plastic in the receiving environment. So combining the input from all those rivers, whereabouts do you see the highest density, and from that we can work back to identifying the key sources within the model in terms of where the plastic's coming from, but also look at mitigation options. So if you're looking at putting out traps for trapping the plastics once they're in the bay, what are the best places for putting those in terms of effectiveness? So again, just giving you an example of how we can use these models to identify sources and sinks. Third international example is looking at salmon lice outbreaks in aquaculture areas. So this is a study in Norway. So here we build a model which is getting more complicated in terms of the processes involved. So we're looking at the life cycle of the salmon lice, so that age and mortality, their vertical swimming behaviour, and then just how they grow in terms of different light levels and day length and things like that. So building up that complexity in terms of what it is we're modelling in the water column, but essentially it's the same process of understanding that connectivity. The outcomes of this work was a national-wide forecasting system, so identifying that connectivity, saying if there's an outbreak of salmon lice in one particular aquaculture area, how connected is that area to other aquaculture areas along the Norwegian coastline, and what management strategies need to be put in place to stop the spread of the sea lice through the system, and that might include shutting down particular farms or looking at the pharmaceutical side of things in terms of dosing other farms that are strongly connected to the farm where there has been an outbreak. So again, understanding that connection in the system. So just some examples locally in terms of the work that DHI New Zealand has carried out. First of all, we're looking at the Firth of Thames and looking at the input of total nitrogen from the catchment. So looking at the inputs from the river systems that feed into the Firth of Thames. And the way we do this is just look at a first order decay approach. So we introduce a tracer, which is representative of total nitrogen, and then we add in a decay to that. So it's the concentration is reducing through time due to a single first order decay. Now, this approach simplifies the complexity of carrying out nutrient cycling. So looking at the net effect of phytoplankton growth, uptake, and the nutrient cycling within sediments and the water column and the atmosphere. And we found this is a good approach in terms of estimating the potential extent of total nitrogen footprints from particular sources. So it's a very simplified approach, but very useful in terms of understanding the systems. So what we can do, we can assign a tracer to individual rivers. We've got estimates of total nitrogen loads coming in from each of these individual rivers within the system, and we can run the model. This particular model is run for 3 months over winter when the highest loads are coming into the system. And then this is just a snapshot of the predicted mean total nitrogen concentration in the surface layer of the model for one particular river source, with the red being the highest concentration near the source and the lighter blue through the darker blue, reducing concentrations. And we can repeat that for other sources. Here we have another source a bit further to the north, much lower loads coming in, so lower concentrations. The Waihau River, which is the largest input of nitrogen to the system. A couple of smaller rivers coming in along the Coromandel coastline, along the eastern shoreline there. And then finally the Piaka River, which again has a high nutrient load coming into the system. So based on those individual inputs to the system, we can then define the total nitrogen concentration within the Firth of Thames. So combining the individual model runs to give us the total nitrogen, and then we can define this map showing the percentage contribution of each of the individual sources. So here we have the Waihau River in the bottom right of the image there. We can see that it's contributing over 95% of the predicted total nitrogen in the water column, right near the source, but you can see it has relatively widespread influence in terms of the total nitrogen budget. And then similarly with the other sources, we can map the contribution that those individual sources have to the total nitrogen. So again, it's a useful process in terms of identifying key locations where nutrient levels might be of concern, and then tracking those back through the system to identify which sources influence the predicted concentrations. And then so we can go through those different sources and map out the zone of influence of those different riverine sources. The next example is just looking at oil spill modelling. So this was a project that we did several years ago. There was a small oil spill from the Port of Tauranga area, and we were asked by the local council to sort of map where that oil spill may have gone in terms of the cleanup process. So a lot of complexity in terms of what we're trying to model in the marine space, and there was a lot of uncertainties in terms of that oil spill, in terms of the volume of oil that was spilt when the spill actually started. So it was not. It was, a lot of unknowns in terms of what we were trying to model, but we carried out a whole lot of sensitivity testing of the different processes within the model to map out where that oil spill may have gone immediately after it happened within Tauranga Harbour. So here we have just a snapshot of the predicted oil concentration. So this is in the surface layer. So it's just showing the movement of the oil through time immediately after the spill. So we can see on the spill, we know the spill happened on the incoming tide. So the plume itself has moved down this main channel away from the spill area to the southern end of this particular part of Tauranga Harbour. So we can track that through time in terms of the spread of the plume itself through time, where it's going. And then ultimately at the end of that simulation, we can also map where it's ended up. So where does it get stranded along particular areas of the harbour. So the image on the left is the predicted areas where the oil has stuck along various intertidal areas, and then the map on the right is the areas where they went out and observed oil and did the cleanup process. So this was used to guide the cleanup process, and also reassure the client that the oil hadn't gone into other parts of the harbour in terms of moving into the western part of the harbour or towards the east, the two embayments shown there within the image. So it was just that tracking process and running sensitivity tests with the model itself to map out that connection between the oil spill source and where it may have gone over the immediate few hours after the spill. The next example of connectivity is to do with invasive species and shellfish restoration. So again, this is a case of identifying source locations. Where have invasive species been observed? What areas are you looking at doing shellfish restoration, and what are the potential connection of those places in terms of the marine space? So essentially we do the same. We track particles with species behaviour. So that might be the length of the pelagic phase, so how long larvae may be in the water column, tolerance to salinity and or fresh water, things like settling rate, which may change with time, swimming behaviour, and then importantly looking at habitat preference. So if you're looking at shellfish, the spread of shellfish, we need to consider rocky reefs versus sandy versus muddy habitats. So the connectivity approach can be used here for identifying areas of high connectivity. So for example, that could be used for surveillance planning for invasive species. So if you get an outbreak at a known location, you can use the approach to identify other areas where you might have to go and sample to see if there's been a spread of that particular invasive species. And then there's the add-on benefit of shellfish restoration, so looking at natural spreading. So once the new shellfish bed is established, how much more may that area increase with time, just again due to that connectivity of the system. So this is work I did back in 2009 in Whangarei Harbour. So it was looking at seeding particular areas within the harbour and looking at the natural connectivity of those areas in terms of once a shellfish bed is established, where might you see new areas being developed. So basically using the approach to identify that connectivity, as an area sort of isolated and you won't get significant spreading, or as the strong connection between a particular area and the next embayment and also subsequent connectivity. So in terms of invasive species, Undaria, there's been an outbreak of that in Fiordland National Park. Fanworms are quite widespread in terms of an invasive species within the marine areas within New Zealand. So lots of examples of different invasive species. So what we can do with the models is just look at the potential spread of these invasive species based on a calibrated hydrodynamic model. So here we have the Firth of Thames model, and down in this area here we've got a hypothetical invasive species. So there's been an observation of a fanworm outbreak within Coromandel Harbour, which is in the upper part of the Firth of Thames. And we could run the model through just to look at how that outbreak may actually spread through time, and the key pathways that an invasive species might take. So if we just run that animation, we can see that we get that initial spread of the invasive species mostly contained within Coromandel Harbour itself. So you can see that localised spreading due to the tidal currents within the Coromandel Harbour. But we can begin to see some spreading further up the coast. And then we're a week into the model simulation, and there's a northeasterly wind develops, which begins to push particles out into the wider Firth of Thames and Hauraki Gulf. So we can see the combined effect of that northeasterly wind pushing particles out of Coromandel Harbour and the tidal currents moving the particles in and out with the tidal currents. And then we can see we get back to the more predominant southwesterly winds, again moving particles towards that eastern shoreline, and again that more localised spreading within Coromandel Harbour, but also in the coast immediately to the north of the site. So again, we can use this information to say, well, if we do observe an outbreak in a particular area, where else might we expect to see this invasive species? So we can look at hypothetical sites. So again, this is just saying if we looked at 4 sites where there's been observation of fanworms present, how those different sites different in terms of the connectivity that we see. So we've got site A, which is in the Firth of Thames, D, which is the Coromandel example I just showed you, and then this area B near Waiheke Island, and then C, which is towards the Tamaki estuary, towards the western part of the model domain. So if we end up running the same model and mapping sort of where the spread of that invasive species has been, so this map's just showing the percentage of the total mass in the water column during the full simulation. So we see quite widespread movement along this coastline, strong tidal currents in this area moving the particles up and down the coast, some movement into the Coromandel Harbour and further north, and also some spreading across into the shallower areas here. And you can see quite relatively high mass within the deeper parts of the Firth of Thames. Area B, much more localised spread due to the currents through this particular channel. Area C, towards the Tamaki Strait, we see some movement into the Tamaki estuary. So if there had been an outbreak of the invasive species in this particular area, this would be a key site in terms of follow-on surveillance work in terms of, well, where might we see fanworms spreading to from this particular outbreak. And similarly along the embayments within the Waiheke Island, we see some hotspots there in terms of potential connection. And then finally, just the example that I showed on the animation at site D within Coromandel Harbour, we see predominantly localised spread with some movement to the north there. And even though the animation showed those particles moving up and down the Firth of Thames and across, the actual mass of those ones, in terms of the total mass released, is relatively small. So again, that mapping exercise in terms of where would you start looking for other areas of invasion. So now going to start talking about sediment generation, and again looking at that connection between sediment generation within the catchment of an area and where that ends up within the marine space. So the first example is from Lucas Creek in the Upper Waitemata Harbour in Auckland. So here we linked a sediment generation model, which is the Russell model. So this model takes a combination of rainfall, soil type, elevation, so the topography of the catchment, and then estimates of sediment generation based on land use management practices and erosion control. So the map on the right here shows the sediment generation map. So the red is the areas of highest sediment generation, and the green is the areas of lowest sediment generation. And then that was linked to a coupled hydrodynamic sediment transport model. So we took the outputs from the Russell approach at the very top end of the catchment up here and looked at where that sediment ended up within the marine space. So we subdivided the Lucas Creek itself into these sub-estuaries labelled 1 to 22. So just looking at different subtidal and intertidal areas. And then we used the model to make some predictions in terms of deposition that we see within those sub-estuaries. So we can see sub-estuary 16, which is the one immediately downstream of the catchment outlet. It's where you see the highest level of deposition. So we can see up to 30 millimetres per annum in that area, which ties back to core data that's been collected in the area, showing those high sedimentation rates. And we see the next highest level, 16 millimetres per year, and the sort of strip through the middle of the estuary here, which is a combined subtidal intertidal sub-estuary. So what we could do for this project was we were working for the local community group who were looking at planting within the catchment in terms of trying to improve the level of deposition that was seen within Lucas Creek. So by linking the predictions from the harbour model with the predictions from the Russell sediment generation model, they were able to map areas where they wanted to go out and plant to improve the levels of deposition. So it was a very useful exercise for them in terms of understanding the linkages between where you get high levels of sediment generation, areas where they could go and plant and maybe have a useful outcome in terms of reducing levels of deposition within the Lucas Creek itself. So the next example is Porirua Harbour. So this is work we did for Greater Wellington Regional Council, looking at quantifying the effects of potential land use scenarios on the marine space. So we had catchment data from a wider technical team, which included Niwa, Jacobs and Morpham. So outputs from the catchment modelling were fed into the calibrated wave hydrodynamic and sediment transport model and used for mapping where sediments go within the marine receiving space. And as well as sediments, we were looking at nutrients, metals and indicator bacteria, which I'll now sort of cover in terms of the connectivity approach. So in terms of indicator bacteria, we have these different criteria in terms of a grading of a particular area. So we may have a particular site within Porirua Harbour, and there's been monitoring of that site over many years in terms of the enterococci levels that are observed at that site. So based on the monitoring data, there's a quantifying criteria from A being good, where the median concentration is less than 40, the 95th percentile concentration is less than or equal to 40, etc. So you get a overall criteria based on these different exceedances and concentrations. So this sort of information was used to look at the attributes at different sites within the harbour. So Greater Wellington Regional Council identified there was 20 plus sites within the harbour, and we used the model which was linked back to the catchment model to define the different criteria within these different sites. So how do we do that? We have individual catchment sources, and each of those has a unique identifier in terms of modelling enterococci coming into the system, and then the model can be used to provide the combined effect of all of those catchment outlets on a particular site. And then so we identify for each catchment outlet, we have a unique name for the enterococci, and then post-process that data to derive the total predicted concentrations. So what can we do with the model? So again, we can identify particular sites. So here we've got a recreational site of interest to Greater Wellington Regional Council, and we can use the model data to say, well, what are the linkages between the different subcatchments, which is the names in the green part of the table there. So the different subcatchments and what they contribute to the overall predicted concentration. So we see Porirua Mouth, which is this one to the south here. It's the largest catchment largest load coming into the system, contributes 75% of the observed, or the predicted concentration at that site. Mahinawa, which is another site adjacent to the site, to the recreational site, 15%. And then reducing contributions from other catchment inputs. One of interest was Onipoto Fringe, which was a sub-catchment within the other arm of the Porirua Harbour, and so there was a 2% contribution due to inputs from quite remote sub-catchments. And again, this just highlighted the need for the connectivity approach in terms of understanding which catchments are influencing particular sites in terms of predicted enterococci. So the outcome was looking at different land use scenarios. So we've got the baseline, which is the current land use, and looking at some of the gradings based on the model simulations. And again, there was a calibration process to look at how the model was comparing to the actual observed concentrations. And then a series of land use scenarios between the current land use and a water sensitive urban design scenario, which is very intensive in terms of the mitigation options being put in place. So we can see at all of these sites that there's an improvement in the attribute, so going from poor to fair, poor to good, etc. And so what can be done with the models is use that understanding of connectivity to identify which sources would need to be improved to improve MAC grading. So if, for example, the water ski site, the outcome was a improvement from good to excellent, what strategies would need to be put in place in terms of particular catchments and reducing the loads coming into the system? So it's really providing that focus in terms of understanding the system and working back through to provide input to the planning of future land use change. And then in terms of the sediments, same process. So looking at the sediments, so the same approach as we had in Lucas Creek. So this was work carried out by Mel Green, Lee Stevens, and Megan Oliver in 2014. So it's linking catchment load models to marine models. So subdividing the area into these different sub-estuaries and looking at the linkages between the outputs from a particular catchment and the sub-estuaries. So we see the Pāoa-Tahanui catchment here has a certain sediment load coming off it, and there's linkages back to this large subtidal sub-estuary, Browns Bay sub-estuary, and then small linkages to these other two sub-estuaries. So that was sort of starting point for the Porirua work. So we carried out a broad range of modelling, which included looking at events in terms of delivering sediment to the system, and also an annual simulation. So the starting point was looking at the overall sediment budget. So how much sediment's coming into the system, where does that sediment end up, how much is being exported. So we've got 23 to 27% has actually been exported from the system, and the remaining 73, 77% is deposited within the two arms of the harbour, the Onipoto arm and the Pāoa-Tahanui inlet. But we also looked at the connection in the system, so looking at all the different catchment outlets around the shoreline of the two arms of the harbour, looking at this is just a plot showing the mean flow by each of these sites. So the biggest catchment, Porirua, the biggest mean flow to two larger sub-catchments within the Pāoa-Tahanui inlet. And then based on that, we can subdivide the harbour itself into these sub-estuaries and start looking at the linkages between the catchments and the sub-estuaries. So what we did for this work was develop this sort of rather ugly looking table, which defines the connection between the sub-catchments. So on the left, it's all the different sub-catchments feeding into the system, and then the sub-estuaries along the top. So this was just for the Onipoto arm, and you can see the sum of all the values is 100%. So we're saying of all the deposition we see within the Onipoto arm, 37% can be attributed to the Porirua Mouth subcatchment, and then it deposits within the Aotea sub-estuary. So a lot of information within this table, but not that intuitive in terms of what it all means. And it takes a lot of explaining to a client to talk them through what this means in terms of understanding what needs to happen within the catchments to reduce overall sedimentation. And finally, just looking at the Okura Waiti project that we carried out for Auckland Council. Again, this was to quantifying the effects of potential land use change on the marine receiving environment. So in this case, we had catchment data from the freshwater management tool, which Auckland Council were developing at a regional scale. And outputs from the freshwater management tool were used as inputs to the calibrated wave hydrodynamic and sediment transport model. So again, just looking at the linkages between those different subcatchments and subestuaries within that system. Now, what we did for this project was develop a web portal which brought together all the data that was used within the project. So looking at the freshwater management tool data, the field data that was collected, and then a summary of the model outputs. So again, how do we do this? We have different sources of subcatchments coming into the system, and then a receiving environment model. So we run a series of different simulations with different identifiers for each subcatchment, and then we can start looking at that connection within the receiving environment. So coming back to the web portal that we developed for this project, so this is looking at combining all of that data that we've used for the project. So we've got the catchment data tab, field data tab, model results, which supplies a summary of the actual outputs from the model, and then a connectivity matrix tab, which is sort of combining that earlier spreadsheet type approach to a more intuitive way of looking at that information. If we just quickly run through some of that information, so we can look at the catchment data. So a particular input from the Silverdale catchment, which is in the top part of this Waiti system. So we've got the Waiti River down here, and the Silverdale catchment runs up in this highly sort of developed area to the west. And we just see the time series along the bottom here. So this is 15 years of input data. This is total suspended sediment concentrations over that 15-year period. The user can zoom in on a particular area and look at peaks or whatever they want to. And then on the right here is a summary of the catchment input data. So the catchment area, sediment yield for that particular catchment, and then zinc and copper loads as well. So it gives a quick summary of the inputs to the system. Similarly for the field data, we collected site-specific data. So here we're looking at this particular site out in Karapiro Bay, and we can see there's three sort of large wave events that happened during the deployment period. They're very important in terms of resuspending existing seabed sediments and catchment-derived sediments. It's important to get that component of the physical forcing right within the model. And then finally, just looking at outputs from the model, so the user can look at a particular scenario, so they can pick a particular land use scenario, and then a map showing a snapshot of total suspended sediment concentration. I think this is the 95th percentile concentration during the whole model run. And similarly, looking at deposition, so where does sediment for a particular land use scenario end up within the marine space? And then there's also an ability to show an animation, so you can click on that tab and it'll animate the predictions from the model to show what's happening over the 4-month simulation that was done. So in terms of web portal, just a quick overview of the information within that. And then again, looking at these rather complex looking arrays. So we've got catchment outlets along the left there, and then sub-estuaries along the top. So you can see it's starting to get pretty complex in terms of understanding the information and that connectivity. So one of the key outputs of the developing the web portal was actually presenting this data in a more intuitive way. So we've moved into this map-based approach. So we've got the sub-estuaries defined in the marine space. So Marine Reserve, Karapiro Bay, Tongaparoa, etc. So these different sub-estuaries. And then this map is just showing that same information, but with the color coding showing the, in this case, the percentage of the total deposition due to a particular subcatchment. So we can see this map showing the linkage between the Silverdale subcatchment and how much of the total deposition within this sub-estuary that we see due to the Silverdale subcatchment. So if we just highlight that here, we see 77% of the deposition seen within that sub-estuary can be attributed to the Silverdale subcatchment. And then if we just move through the Waiiti system, so we've got the mid-Waiiti sub-estuary, we can see 7% of the observed deposition is due to the Silverdale subcatchment, and outer Waiiti, just 2% of the observed deposition is due to the Silverdale subcatchment. So we can see that the majority of the sediment ends up within this upper Waiiti, and some of it is moved into these middle and outer Waiiti. There's strong tidal currents through this area, which is exporting Silverdale sediment to the wider environment. But what this is also telling us is that inputs from other subcatchments are important in terms of the observed deposition within these two sub-estuaries. And similarly, we can look at the upper Okura estuary. So we see that the linkages between the Karapiro subcatchment, which is in this area here, we can see that 30% of the deposition predicted within the upper Okura estuary is actually due to the Karapiro Beach subcatchment. And similarly, the upper Waiiti, we see 13% of the deposition seen within that sub-estuary can be attributed back to the Karapiro subcatchment. So again, quite intuitive in terms of understanding those connections. And then, and finally, just looking at that Karapiro Beach subcatchment, we can see 31% is in this sub-estuary, which we called the Outer Gulf. So it's basically saying sediments are moved through the system. So this is an open beach and exposed to waves. So 30% of the sediment that are generated within the subcatchment actually end up within the deeper parts of the water in the outer Karapiro Bay. And then if we turn that around and start looking at sub-estuaries, we can map the same data, but focus on a particular sub-estuary. So in this case, the numbers are the percentage of sediment from an individual subcatchment within this sub-estuary. So we can see for the Marine Reserve sub-estuaries, some quite low numbers there. So 2.3% of the sediment generated within the Long Bay subcatchment, which is this one around here, ends up within the Marine Reserve, and then very small percentages from the other subcatchments end up in the Marine Reserve. So that's giving an indication of the fact that there's the sediment that's deposited within the Marine Reserve is spread across many different subcatchments. There's no predominant subcatchment in terms of the deposition that's observed there. And if we go to other sub-estuaries, so here we've got the sub-estuary in the middle of the Okura estuary and the linkages back to those different subcatchments. So we can see if we highlight this particular subcatchment, North Shore, 25% of the sediment derived from that subcatchment ends up within this sub-estuary. And again, linking back to the Karapiro Beach subcatchment. So this is the subcatchment here. we see that 15% of the sediment that's generated there ends up within that particular sub-estuary. And again, this is going back to the Silverdale, so we see that 77% again. So the 77% of the sediment generated here ends up within this sub-estuary. It's a very intuitive way of displaying that information and distilling down the outputs from that from the modelling. So that's hopefully given you a introduction to the whole connectivity approach in terms of the different applications that we can use in terms of understanding those linkages between sources and sinks. So, and this approach can be used for many different contaminants, invasive species, shellfish, etc. And essentially, it's a process of identifying key sources and sinks within the system. And then the modelling approach quantifies how a particular site of interest is connected to a particular source. And so this provides useful input to the planning process in terms of, as I talked about, land use change, invasive species surveillance, shellfish restoration, oil or dredge spill assessments, etc. And the interactive web portal combines all this project data into one repository and provides a more intuitive way of displaying the data in terms of the whole connectivity approach.